A cold, unforgiving snowstorm raged through the dense forest, its howling winds cutting through the towering trees like icy knives. The world was swallowed in a blinding white, the relentless snowfall erasing all signs of life. In this desolate landscape, where survival was a battle against the elements, a soft, desperate cry echoed, a sound so frail, so helpless, it barely reached beyond the roar of the storm. Amid the thick, swirling snow, a tiny form lay still. A baby, barely a few months old, swaddled in nothing more than a thin cloth. The fabric was damp, its protection meaningless against the bitter cold. The child's small body trembled, tiny fists clenched in agony as the cruel wind lashed at its delicate skin. The baby's cries were weak, muffled by the endless snowflakes that settled upon its fragile frame. Every breath was a struggle, each one fainter than the last. The storm did not care for innocence, did not spare the defenseless. Then, in the darkness of the storm, something moved. A pair of glowing blue eyes pierced through the blizzard, unblinking, sharp, and filled with a quiet power. A figure emerged, a white tiger, its majestic form blending seamlessly with the snow around it. Its powerful muscles rippled beneath thick fur, built to withstand the very storm that sought to claim the tiny life before it. The tiger's ears twitched, its keen senses honing in on the source of the pitiful cries. A single step forward, the snow crunched beneath its heavy paws. The beast was no ordinary predator. There was intelligence behind those piercing eyes. It sniffed the air, analyzing, discerning. The scent was unmistakable. A child, barely clinging to life, abandoned in the frozen abyss. The tiger hesitated. Its instincts were torn. This was not its kind. This was a creature of man, weak, defenseless. In the wild, the laws were cruel, unwavering. Yet, something in the tiger's chest stirred. The baby whimpered, its tiny fingers curling weakly, reaching for a warmth that did not exist. The tiger's heart pounded. A choice had to be made. Leaving the baby meant certain death. The snow was relentless, merciless. No human scent lingered nearby. No mother, no father, no one. The tiger's massive head lowered, its warm breath washing over the infant's face. The baby stirred slightly at the sensation, its body instinctively seeking the heat. Without further hesitation, the great beast carefully clamped its powerful jaws around the tiny child, cradling it with the gentleness of a mother carrying her cub. The tiger lifted its head, the baby secure, protected within the warmth of its thick fur. Then it ran, the race against time. The forest blurred past in streaks of white and gray as the tiger moved with powerful, measured strides. Its paws slammed against the frozen ground, sending snow flying in its wake. The storm howled around them, furious, unrelenting, as if enraged that its prey was being stolen away. The tiger did not stop. It could not stop. Each step was a battle against exhaustion, against the biting cold that seeped into its very bones. The child in its mouth barely stirred, its breath faint, its body frighteningly still. The tiger knew it had little time. The infant needed warmth, needed safety, needed a miracle. Where could it go? The wilderness stretched for miles, endless and merciless. The tiger had no den, no refuge against the storm. It was a creature of the wild, thriving in solitude. Yet now, carrying this fragile life, it felt a new urgency, a desperation it had never known before. Then, in the distance, a flicker, a glow, barely visible through the thick veil of snow. A human presence. A chance. The tiger pushed forward, its massive body surging through the storm with renewed energy. The light grew closer, stronger. A small tent, the fabric rippling against the raging winds, its entrance barely visible. The scent of fire, of warmth, reached the tiger's keen nose. With one final bound, it stopped just outside the tent. The encounter. Inside the tent, a lone traveler sat huddled near a small heater, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The storm had forced him to seek shelter, his journey through the frozen wilderness halted by nature's fury. His provisions were running low, but he had enough to last a night, enough to wait until the blizzard passed. Then he heard it, a deep, rhythmic panting just outside the tent. A heavy presence, its breath slow, measured. Something was there. His heart pounded, slowly, Cautiously, he reached for the small knife by his side. He wasn't alone in this forest, and whatever waited outside was large, powerful. He swallowed hard, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for the zipper of the tent entrance. With a slow pull, he unzipped it just enough to peek outside, and froze. A massive white tiger stood before him. Its fur dusted with snow, its piercing blue eyes locked onto his. Fear surged through the man's veins. He had seen many beasts in his travels, but none like this. None so close. None staring at him with such intense purpose. Then he noticed something else. A small, frail bundle cradled gently in the tiger's mouth. A baby. Shock washed over him. His breath caught in his throat. The child, where had it come from? How was it still alive in this storm? And more importantly, why had this tiger, this apex predator, carried it here instead of devouring it? The tiger lowered its massive head, carefully placing the baby onto the snow-covered ground. The man hesitated, uncertainty warring with instinct. He could not understand what he was seeing, could not comprehend why this beast had delivered a human child to him. But one look at the shivering infant told him everything he needed to know. There was no time for questions. He dropped to his knees, scooping the baby into his arms. His own body was chilled, but to the child, he was a furnace. He quickly wrapped it in the thickest blanket he could find, holding it close to his chest, feeling the faint heartbeat against his own. Relief flooded through him as he felt the tiny body stir, heard the faintest whimper of life. His gaze lifted back to the tiger. The great beast watched in silence, its blue eyes unreadable. Snow clung to its thick fur, ice crystals forming along its whiskers. It had braved the storm, defied nature, to bring this child here. And now its job was done. The man swallowed the lump in his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." The tiger did not respond. It simply turned, stepping back into the storm, its massive form vanishing into swirling white as silently as it had come. The man clutched the baby closer, his heart heavy with unspoken gratitude. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, all was calm. And for the first time since the storm began, the baby sighed softly, safe at last. The storm raged on outside, its fury undiminished. But inside the small tent, all was still. The traveler held the infant close, his arms a shield against the cold that had nearly stolen its fragile life. The child, wrapped in a thick woolen blanket, barely stirred. Its breaths were slow, weak, but steady. The man's heart pounded. He was a wanderer, a man without ties or obligations, but at this moment, something shifted within him. The weight of responsibility settled upon his shoulders like an unexpected snowfall, heavy yet resolute. This child, delivered to him by the very heart of the wilderness, was now his to protect. His gaze shifted to the tent's entrance, where the great white tiger had stood just moments ago. The beast had disappeared into the storm, its silent departure leaving only a sense of awe and gratitude in its wake. A guardian in the night, a protector beyond reason. The man had traveled far and seen much, but nothing had ever shaken him quite like this. He gently adjusted the blanket around the baby, running his fingers along its tiny hands, now slightly warmer. How long had the child been out there? Who had left it to such a cruel fate? He had seen desperation before, wars, famine, and the cost of human cruelty, but this was something else, a deliberate abandonment. The baby whimpered softly, its small face scrunching in discomfort. The man hurriedly reached for his small pack, searching for something, anything, that could help. A flask of warm tea, a scrap of bread, but none of it was suitable for an infant. He needed milk, he needed supplies, and he needed them soon. With careful movements, he bundled the baby against his chest, securing it within his thick fur-lined coat. The storm outside was still vicious, but staying here was not an option. The child needed nourishment, warmth beyond a single tent and a meager heater. There was a village, a small one, perhaps a few miles west, if his memories serve him right. He had no choice. Taking a deep breath, he braced himself before stepping out into the storm, the journey to salvation. The cold hit him like a hammer, slicing through the layers of his coat, as if they were nothing. The wind roared in his ears, but he pressed forward, each step heavy against the deep snow. The baby remained secured against his chest, shielded from the worst of the storm by his body heat. He could feel its faint breath, could hear the occasional soft whimper that reassured him the child was still fighting. The village had to be close. The path was treacherous. Snow piled in uneven drifts, masking hidden dangers beneath. More than once, his foot slipped, sending him lurching forward, barely catching himself before falling. But he could not stop. Every minute spent battling the storm was another minute the child remained in peril. Then, through the blinding white, he saw it, a warm glow in the distance. Lanterns. His breath hitched. The village, summoning the last reserves of his strength. He pushed forward, stumbling onto the outskirts of the settlement. The wooden houses, their roofs burdened with snow, lined the narrow paths. Smoke curled from chimneys, the scent of burning with a stark contrast to the icy world around him. He staggered toward the first house with light in its windows. Raising a trembling fist, he pounded on the door. Seconds passed. Then the sound of movement, a lock turning. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman wrapped in a thick shawl. Her sharp eyes widened as she took in the sight before her. A half-frozen man clutching a bundled infant to his chest. "Please," he rasped, his voice hoarse from the cold. "The child, it needs help." The woman did not hesitate. She stepped aside, ushering him in with swift urgency. The warmth of the house engulfed him instantly, the flickering fireplace casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. He barely made it 2 steps before his knees buckled, exhaustion finally claiming him. But before darkness took him, he saw the woman reaching for the baby, her hands gentle, her expression one of both shock and determination. The child was safe. And then he let go, an uncertain future. The first thing he noticed when he awoke was the smell of broth. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dimly lit room. He was lying on a cot, covered in thick blankets. The fire crackled softly nearby, its warmth chasing away the last remnants of the storm's grip. For a moment, he was disoriented. Then memories came rushing back. The storm, the tiger, the baby. He sat up abruptly, his gaze searching. Across the room, the elderly woman sat in a chair, rocking the infant in her arms. The baby was dressed in fresh linens, its cheeks no longer deathly pale. It cooed softly, tiny fingers curling around the woman's own. Relief crashed over him like a wave. "You're awake," the woman said without looking up. Her voice was steady, but there was an undertone of curiosity, of suspicion. "You brought this child through the storm. I've never seen anyone so foolish or so determined." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his damp hair. "I found it in the snow," he said quietly. "Alone, left to die." The woman's grip on the baby tightened slightly. "And the tiger?" His head snapped up. "You know?" Her gaze finally met his. "You spoke of it in your fever. A white tiger carrying the child." He hesitated. He had barely understood himself. But now, seeing the baby alive and safe, he knew one thing for certain. The tiger had saved this child for a reason. And now, that responsibility had passed to him. "I don't know why it did what it did," he admitted, "but it brought the baby to me and I couldn't just leave it." The woman studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Well then," she said, rising to her feet, "it seems fate has placed this child in your hands. The question is, what will you do with that?" He looked at the baby, so small, so fragile, and yet it had survived the impossible. He had wandered the world for years, never belonging anywhere, never tethered to anyone. But now, as he reached out and gently took the child from the woman's arms, he felt something he had never known before. Purpose. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world in a silent, glistening blanket of white. Inside, for the first time in a long time, warmth filled his heart. The village remained buried in snow, its rooftops weighed down by nature's frozen hand. The storm had passed, but the air was still thick with the remnants of its fury. The man stood by the window, gazing at the quiet landscape outside. Behind him, the infant lay nestled in thick blankets, its small chest rising and falling in peaceful slumber. Days had passed since the storm, and yet the memory of that fateful night still lingered like a vivid dream. the old woman who had taken him and moved about the small cottage, her hand steady as she prepared warm porridge. She had not questioned him further about the tiger, but he knew she had not forgotten. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that something beyond reason had occurred that night. The child had survived. But what now? He had never intended to take care of anyone, let alone an infant with no past, no name. He had spent years wandering, untethered to any place or person, and now fate had placed his fragile life in his hands. He knew he could not abandon it, not after all that had happened. But what did he have to offer? He was no father, no guardian. He had no home to return to, no riches to provide comfort. All he had were his hands, his will to survive, and the quiet pull of something greater than himself. A soft cry stirred him from his thoughts. The baby's tiny fingers flexed as its mouth opened in protest. Hunger. The man turned away from the window, approaching the small cot where the child lay. The old woman was already there, scooping the baby into her arms with practiced ease. She glanced at him over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "You'll have to learn," she said simply, cradling the infant against her chest. "Babies do not wait." The words settled heavily in his mind. He had always lived by instinct, by survival. Now he had to learn something entirely different. Patience, care, the fragility of life beyond his own. The days passed, each one bringing something new. The baby grew stronger, its cries louder, its tiny limbs stretching with newfound strength. The man learned to hold the child, to feed it, to soothe its restless nights. He had never known such vulnerability in another creature, never felt such responsibility pressed down on him with every passing hour. But something in the child's eyes and its quiet resilience reminded him of that fateful night, the night the tiger had carried it through the storm, defying nature itself. At times, when the world was silent, he wondered if the tiger was still out there, watching. The thought unsettled him, but not in fear. It was a connection he did not understand, a thread tying him to something beyond his comprehension. He had never believed in fate, never placed stock in the whims of the universe. But this child, this impossible meeting, had changed something in him. As the child grew, so did the whispers in the village. Strangers did not go unnoticed in a place as small as this. Rumors spread of a baby found in the storm, of a man with no past, of a white tiger seen lurking in the woods. The villagers spoke in hushed voices, their eyes cautious when they crossed paths with him. He could feel their suspicion, their quiet wariness. They did not ask questions, but their silence spoke louder than words. The old woman, however, remained unfazed. She carried on as she always had, tending to her home, to the child, and now to him. She never pried, never demanded answers he was not ready to give. Instead, she watched, and when the nights grew long and the weight of uncertainty pressed heavily upon him, she would simply say, "The wind carries many things. Some are meant to stay." One evening, as he gathered firewood near the edge of the forest, he felt it again, a presence, eyes watching from the shadows between the trees. He turned slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. And there, just beyond the reach of the fading sunlight, stood the white tiger. Its massive frame was still, its glowing blue eyes fixed on him. The same piercing gaze that had stared at him that night, the night everything had changed. The tiger did not move, did not advance. It simply watched. The man felt no fear, only the strange, undeniable pull of something ancient, something beyond mere instinct. Minutes passed in silence before the tiger blinked, its head dipping ever so slightly. Then, with the grace of phantom, it turned and disappeared into the depths of the forest. That night, as he sat by the fire, he could not shake the feeling that the tiger had not left, that it never had. The child, now stronger, healthier, reached for him with small hands. He lifted the infant, holding it close. The warmth of the fire flickered against their faces, and in that quiet moment he understood. The tiger had chosen the child, and now so had he. The once frail infant, rescued from the clutches of the storm, had become a strong and graceful boy. His hair was as white as the snow from which he had been saved, his eyes sharp and piercing blue. mirrors of the tiger's gaze that had once watched over him. He moved with an uncanny agility, his instincts sharper than those of an ordinary child. The village had long accepted him, though whispers never truly faded. They called him the snow-born child, the one touched by the spirit of the white tiger. Some feared him, others revered him, but all knew there was something different about him. The old woman, his guardian, simply watched in quiet understanding, tending to him with the same care she always had. The man who had carried him through the storm remained by his side, never claiming to be his father, yet never leaving him either. Their bond was unspoken, built not by blood but by fate itself. And the tiger, though unseen, was never truly gone. On nights when the moon was full and the forest hummed with unseen life, the boy would wake and stand by the window, gazing toward the trees. He felt it there, a presence, a force that called him in a way he could not yet understand. Sometimes when the wind howled, he swore he could hear a deep, rhythmic breathing, steady as the mountains. Then one fateful evening, everything changed. The village had been peaceful, untouched by the dangers of the outside world. But peace was a fragile thing. Strangers arrived, men draped in heavy furs, their faces shadowed beneath thick hoods. They spoke of the child, the one whispered about beyond the village, the one who had survived the storm that should have claimed him. They sought him not as a boy, but as a curiosity, a thing to be taken, studied, or worse. The man knew danger when he saw it. He had once been a wanderer, and wanderers understood the greed of men all too well. He stood in front of the boy, shielding him as the stranger spoke in low, measured voices. "The child is not yours," one of them said. "No," the man agreed, "but he is not yours either." A tense silence settled between them. The villagers, wary but afraid, did not interfere. They had seen the boy grow, had heard the stories. They knew he was not like them, not entirely. And yet, he was still theirs, still part of them. Fear and loyalty waged war in their hearts. The boy, standing behind the man, did not cower. His hands clenched into fists, his eyes steady. He did not understand everything, but he understood this. These men meant to take him away. And deep inside him, something stirred, something ancient and primal. Then, from the depth of the forest, a low growl rumbled through the air. The wind shifted. The trees trembled. And then, as if the earth itself had willed it into existence, the white tiger stepped forward. Its massive form emerged from the shadows, for gleaming under the pale moonlight. Its eyes, the same piercing blue as the boy's, locked onto the stranger's. A deep, guttural sound vibrated through its chest, a warning, a promise of what would happen should they take one step closer. The men hesitated, their bravado cracking like thin ice. No human had tamed this beast. No chains bound it, no commands controlled it. It was here of its own will, a guardian, a force beyond them, and in its presence, they were nothing more than intruders in a story far greater than themselves. The man who had raised the boy did not move, did not react, as if he had expected this moment all along. But the boy, he stepped forward. Slowly, carefully, he moved toward the tiger. The villagers gasped, the strangers tensed, but the boy showed no fear. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the thick fur of the beast's shoulder. The tiger did not flinch. Instead, it lowered its great head, pressing its forehead against the boy's, a silent recognition, an acceptance, a choice. The men, seeing what they could not comprehend, what they could never own, took a step back. Fear replaced greed. This was not something they could take. This was something beyond them. Without a word, they turned and disappeared into the night, swallowed by the forest they had sought to exploit. The village remained silent, watching, waiting. The tiger, unmoving, watched them leave, then turned its gaze toward the man who had saved the boy all those years ago. A silent understanding passed between them. The man, who had once been nothing but a wanderer, now belonged to something greater than himself. And then, without hesitation, the boy climbed onto the tiger's back. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the beast, carrying the child who had once been left die in the snow, turned and vanished into the forest. The man did not move to stop him. He only stood there, hands clenched at his sides, his heart heavy with both pride and loss. The white tiger had returned for what was always meant to be. And the boy, no longer a child, no longer lost, had finally found where he belonged.